first question is the most obvious one. How did your involvement with the Sea Shepherd movement and preventing Japanese whaling in the Southern Ocean come about?
So back in 2006, we launched this boat called Earth Race, which was built to attempt the world record for circumnavigating the globe in a powerboat. And we ran it on biodiesel fuel. Once we finished our sponsor obligations, so we were just sort of on our way back to New Zealand. We did a tour down the coast of Australia, and one of the journalists at a press conference came and asked me, he said, "What are you going to do now that you've finished the record?" And I sort of just off the cuff, I said, I might take it to Antarctica to disrupt the Japanese whaling, because at that stage, whaling was sort of an issue in Australia. And it started the speculation on a couple of Facebook pages about, hey, what about taking this very cool boat Earth Race down as a Sea Shepherd vessel? And then there was I got a call from Sea Shepherd and flew over to Friday Harbour and met with them over there. And we sort of hatched a plan that would see me sell the boat to either Sea Shepherd or one of their sponsors. And the deal was I would captain it on that first campaign down to Antarctica. And six months later, there I was driving the boat down to Antarctica.
In a boat like Earth Race, or I think it was renamed the Ardy Gill, wasn't it, after it was sold to a Hollywood investor?
Yeah, so there was a guy called Ardy Gill who was he sort of was involved in movies and television in Los Angeles. He put in $1 million and then leased the boat for $1 a year to Sea Shepherd. So he owned it, but it was to be used for Sea Shepherd campaigns to disrupt whaling. So the boat then got renamed Ardy Gill, and that was it thereafter.
So we're talking about a fast boat, aren't we?
Yeah, it had a top speed of 40 knots. If you wanted to go really fast and it was set up right, you could do 40 knots. But that's not extraordinary. There's lots of boats can do a lot faster. The amazing thing about Earth Race really was more the range. Like we took it, for example, from Portugal across the Atlantic, through the Caribbean, across the Pacific to Australia, down that coast and all the way back to New Zealand on a single tank of fuel. Like there's very few boats on the planet that can do that, and especially not a small boat like Earth Race or Ardy Gill. It was an amazingly efficient vessel, and I think it was probably one of the best looking boats of all time. If you put that boat in front of a whole bunch of kids, they would all want to come aboard and check it out. So it was a very special boat in many ways, and I do miss it today actually.
So what are your tactics when you're engaging with the Japanese whaling fleet? What advantages has Ardy Gill got over them?
So the thing with Ardy Gill was that it was fast. Like the harpoon vessels, of which there's the Yushin Maru number 1 and number 2, and then also the Shonan Maru, which is their security vessel. They have a top speed between 22 to 25 knots, which for a big vessel is very fast. Ardy Gill, while we're down there, could easily do 30. And so we were much faster. Up until then, when you look at the disruption that Greenpeace had done against the Japanese whalers and also Sea Shepherd, they'd always struggled keeping up with the harpoon vessels. Ardy Gill changed that, and that we now had a vessel that could keep track of those much bigger vessels and could try and disrupt the actual harpooning operation. You saw it a little bit with some Zodiac work, but Zodiac's are tough in Antarctica, getting beaten up, limited range. So we thought it was going to be a real game changer in terms of disrupting that harpooning operation. And the fact that it could stay down there for a long period of time was this very nimble, agile vessel that could swing in front of these big harpoon vessels. And there was naughty stuff that was going on, like we would engage like prop fowlers and things like that to really disrupt their operations.
What's a prop fowler?
So it's a rope with bits of thing interwoven in it and some floats on the end, and you would throw it out the boat and try and get it to engage in the propellers of these much bigger vessels as they went past. It's not an easy thing to do. You've got these big boats and what's probably the most hostile waters on Earth, and us or other Sea Shepherd vessels driving in front of them trying to drop this rope so that gets caught in the props, and it was relatively unsuccessful when you look at it over the years. There's reasons why in the technical design of those harpoon vessels why it's very hard. But that was the goal, and it made the Japanese lives pretty uncomfortable down there, having to avoid these smaller boats in front of them all of the time.
So in the period of time that the Ardy Gill was operating around the Japanese whaling ships, do you think you did manage to make a difference?
Yeah, probably the key one was the best thing we could do down there was to engage with the Nishin Maru, which is the processing ship, and block the slipway. The slipway is like this ramp at the back of the boat. So here's what happens. A harpoon vessel goes out, shoots a whale, and the whale dies. They then tow it and they transfer it over to the Nishin Maru, and it gets pulled up the slipway on the stern. If one of our vessels blocks that slipway, then it's impossible for them to transfer whales. And there's been many examples where Sea Shepherd has blocked that slipway for up to a month or two, and that's basically shut whaling down while that's happening. And one of the key role that we played in the 2010 campaign was we needed to slow the vessel down, the Nishin Maru, enough to allow one of our bigger vessels to come in and block that slipway. And in fact, that was what we had done in stopping the Nishin Maru on, I think it was January 6th, but a little bit earlier, maybe January 4th. We'd managed to do that. And then, it was a short time later we got run over, which, then changed the entire campaign.
So in the lead up to January 6th and the day of the collision, there'd been some sparring going on between you and the Japanese fleet?
Oh, absolutely. There'd been plenty of sparring going on between us and the Japanese fleet. And look, it's really complicated down there. Like, you've got Japan, they believe it's perfectly legal what they're doing. You've got various NGOs and governments believe it's illegal. And technically what we did down there was illegal. You're not allowed to go and deploy prop fowlers. You're not allowed to go and get in the way of a vessel that's engaged in fishing, for example. They have right-of-way over you. So we're breaking the law in terms of disrupting their operations. But we would also argue they're breaking the law with what they do. And so leading up to that, we had certainly been disrupting their whaling operations as best we could and trying to prevent them from harpooning whales and trying to allow our bigger boats to catch up with them. So you could say there was a little bit of bad blood between ourselves and especially the Shonan Maru, which is their security vessel. And, that vessel's job is to, keep people like us away from the main fleet.
As a layperson, as someone who isn't a sailor and hasn't been down in those waters, what are the things that I don't understand about the reality of being in the subantarctic?
The subantarctic is probably the toughest ocean on Earth. Just to get down there, you're going through the 50s and 60s, which are notorious for destroying boats. Enormous waves. I remember we had this one swell that came through. One thing's with a wave, it's not like a linear piece of water that's the same all the way along. It varies and has these sort of peaks and troughs. And I remember we had this massive swell come in, probably 10 to 12 metres, and I remember seeing one of these breaking waves, and it broke about 100 metres in front of us, and the area of destruction of this wave was like a football field. And we were busy trying to navigate our way through these waters. The fact that we were fast meant that we could sidestep a lot of them. But at night, it's a different story, and you sort of luck of the draw. You're very vulnerable in Antarctica. And then once you get down, into the genuine Antarctic waters, which typically starts at around 63, 64 degrees south, you've got icebergs to go dealing with. You let's say you suffer navigational difficulties or you get disrupted in some way. There's no support down there. There might be a couple of tourist boats, but for the most part, you could be a week from having a rescue vessel come in and help you out. So it's a very remote place. Lots of iceberg, cold. If you fall in the water, people might last maybe 15 minutes before they die. You're in a big boat. It's going to take you half an hour to turn around and pick that person up. So it is a very dangerous stretch of water, and it's taken thousands of lives through history.
And all this is in your mind on the day of January the 6th when you're engaging with the Japanese fleet. And I don't know, the responsibility, the stress, the tiredness, the desire to get something done to make a difference. Tell me about how that day began. What unfolded?
The previous day, so January the 5th, we knew we were getting close to the Nishin Maru. We had some intel from one of the tourist boats that sent us pictures of the Nishin Maru engaged in whaling. So we knew they were really, really close. We'd also started to pick up some... Most vessels, they give off certain EMF signals. So you might have, for example, an engine management system or a piece of electronics. They all have signatures. And we started to pick up this clicking on our VHF radio. So we knew there were boats that were, probably within 40 or 50 miles. We then had this intelligence came through. Here's the position of the Nishin Maru. And we had two vessels capable of intercepting it. There was ourselves and the Bob Barker, which was the other new Sea Shepherd vessel. So we're both heading to these coordinates. No one slept, I don't think. You can try and sleep, but now we're all super excited because our goal even though we'd come across the Shonan Maru up to this, our goal is to shut down the Nishin Maru. And I then got a sat phone call saying that the Bob Barker had found the Nishin Maru and was following them. And at this stage, they're heading straight towards us. So we got instructed to sit there and wait for the Bob Barker and the Nishin Maru to reach us. Then what happened was the Bob Barker sent out 2 of their small boats to try and slow the Nishin Maru down. But it didn't go very well, and the Nishin Maru got out of radar range of this vessel. So we think they're still heading straight towards us, but the Bob Barker's about to lose contact with them. And the Nishin Maru can go quickly for a short period of time. When I say quickly, maybe 14 knots, and that was slightly quicker than the Bob Barker, so they gradually got out of range. So we then got the call, if you come across the Nishin Maru, your job is to slow them down so that the Bob Barker can get right up close to them. And then
Who's making these calls? Just interrupt you for a second. Who's giving you these instructions?
So these were coming from both Paul Watson and from Chuck Swift, who was a captain of the Bob Barker. So there was some, sort of three-way conversation. And some of it was over email as well. The sat phone is not so reliable down there. So so I got the call, you need to go and if you've come across a Nishin Maru, slow them down. And sure enough, then we see the Nishin Maru coming over the horizon. And at this stage, I've been researching this boat for the last year, and suddenly this behemoth comes up. I think it's 8,000 tonne, enormous vessel, very imposing craft. Up till now, all we'd seen is the Shonan Maru, very small boat. So the Nishin Maru comes towards us. We then drop back to the Bob Barker. They give us a prop fouler to try and slow this vessel down. Pick that up, we go in front of the Nishin Maru, weave backwards and forwards, drop this prop foul, the Nishin Maru stops, and then they start again, but just the sheer act of stopping such a big vessel, it cost them several nautical miles, and that allowed the Bob Barker to get much closer and get back within radar range. So in many ways, our job was kind of done for the day, and at this stage, we're very low on fuel. So we've been running down there for at least a month now, and I think I had at that stage probably about 200 litres of fuel left, which in a boat like Earthrace is only a couple of inches in the bottom of the tank. So we pretty much had to stop, but our job was done. We slowed the Nishin Maru such that the Bob Barker caught up with it. And I remember I instructed the Bob Barker came past us, and I went up on the horn of Earthrace with the rest of my crew. Had my engineer Jason. I put him on to drive, and the rest of us went and waved the Bob Barker on. Sort of felt like, hey, job well done.
So you're up on the deck of Ardegill by now?
Yeah, in fact, not on the deck. We were sort of up on what's called the horn, which has got these two horns that ventilate the engine bay, so sort of above the rear deck area, really. So we sat up there and waved the Bob Barker crew on, and then there's this procession of harpoon boats. So the Yushin Maru number 1 comes past, then the Yushin Maru number 2, Yushin Maru number 3, and then the fourth boat was this the Shonan Maru number 2, which is their security vessel. And this is the one we've already had some run-ins with prior to this. And as the boat comes up, so we've got one engine at an idle in gear, and that's moving us forward at about 3 or 4 knots. The other engine is in idle. As the Shonan Maru comes up, so it's approaching us on our port side. So at this stage, we've just waved these other vessels on. It comes up on our port side, and they hit us with what's called an LRAD, which is a military acoustic device, and it sort of disorients you. It makes communications very difficult. It's extremely loud, like it does, and some people it makes you nauseous. Anyway, they start hitting us with this, and they start hitting us with their water cannons. They've got some pretty powerful water cannons on that security vessel. And as this is happening, my guy driving, Jason, he looks out the window and he sees this vessel coming up on our port side behind us. He starts moving to starboard. But the trouble you have with the Ardegill is for you to engage the rudders, you really need to get some water over those. If you're only doing 3 or 4 knots, you'll continue in the same direction.
So you're not as manoeuvrable as you would be if you had both engines running and moving at a faster speed?
Yeah, correct.
Right.
Correct. If the boat's going faster, you get more movement over the rudders, and the boat is much more manoeuvrable. So Jason, what he does is he puts the second engine in gear, he puts the throttles on, and he has the rudder to turn full to starboard. So as we start moving forward, the boat starts turning, but at the same time, the Shonan Maru starts turning to starboard as well. And they were doing, I think according to the Maritime NZ report, they were doing 18 knots at the stage. We start off at about 3 to 4. I think we get up to about 6 knots, but of course it's a much faster vessel beside us. And what actually happened was it actually got pushed over on a couple of successive waves. And I didn't know this at the time. I just remember thinking, holy crap, this boat is going to run us over.
Sorry, who got pushed over? Your boat got pushed over?
No, so what happened was that the Shonan Mara, it's a big vessel, like 70 metres long. And there was a swell coming in that was sort of hitting them on the beam. And as you saw them start to turn, and then a wave sort of pushed them, and it facilitated that turn, and then a second wave on the bow, and you sort of saw it over 2 turns, it turned them quite considerably to starboard, and they ended up sort of hitting us probably about 6 or 8 metres back in the vessel. They basically came right down on top of the boat, and when I look back at the video, it looks quite slow, but at the time it was just happened within seconds. And
so you're not in the place where you would be making decisions as the captain about how to avoid them. That's Jason who's on the controls.
So I'm on the horn with a radio, and looking back on it, if Jason had have put the engines in reverse, we probably would have avoided the collision. He's made his call, like he's looked out the window, and he's seen what's happening, and he's made, if you like, an executive decision. And he says, our best thing is to accelerate and turn to starboard. In hindsight, if there had been a different instruction given, or he had made a different decision, then it could have been a different result. Certainly, if he had gone into reverse. But in the end, I take responsibility. Like, I'm the captain of the boat. You couldn't radio him with the LRADs, but, I still made the call to go on that upper deck and radio instructions. I never told him to accelerate. He made that decision, but I'm the captain, it's still my responsibility, and that's okay.
Okay, so there's a point at which the collision becomes inevitable. What does that feel like as you're watching the ship bearing down on you? It's much bigger than you.
Oh, terrifying. I thought we were going to be run completely over and we'd be bringing people back in body bags. The Shonan Mara is 700 or 800 tonnes. We're only 18. And, the first wave that the Shonan Mara came down on, I remember thinking, this is going to be really, really close, but we're getting hit by water cannons. We can't see because we've got water spraying in our faces and this LRAD, so there's an element of confusion going on as well. And then, I sense Jason starting to accelerate, but us not turning at all. And, there's a point when the Shonan Mara on that second wave, all of us knew we were going to be getting hit. So pretty much everyone at the same moment starts sliding off the horns. We were quite exposed up on the horns there. So we start sliding down into the cockpit area, and then this wave of water comes through. So as the Shonan Mara, it came down on a wave on top of us, and the bow sort of pushed our bow right under the water. And as the bow broke off, this wave of water swept through the boat, and you see it in the video that all of my crew, lucky no one got swept off the back, and we're all just clinging on for dear life as this wave swept over us, and the Shonan Mara sort of goes past, and eventually the water cannon passes us, and the LRAD moves on, and
so they're still firing the water cannon at you at this point.
Yeah, they continue firing the water cannon until they were well past us. But the water cannons, to be fair, they take a long time to move away or turn off. So I suspect it was just that they had them trained on us, and it was going to continue getting us for 20 seconds or whatever.
This is the disputed point, isn't it? I mean, it's partly in the New Zealand Maritime Report, it's partly in the Japanese defence in court, that either you allowed this collision to happen or didn't do enough to prevent the collision.
Look, under maritime law, the Arigil is what's called the stand-on vessel. We have right-of-way. The Shonan Mara is the overtaking vessel. Their obligation is to keep well clear. And they're also, once they get past a certain overtaking point, they're now the portside vessel, and they have an obligation to keep clear. So under maritime law, we're the stand-on vessel and have right-of-way. But, so taking that view, the Shonan Mara bears major responsibility. But the second point of it, the captain of any boat, if there's a close quarters encounter that is about to happen, you have the obligation to use all measures possible to avoid a collision. The fact that we're the stand-on vessel doesn't absolve us of responsibility in this. And I accept that, but I'd also make the point, our entire time down there, we are in breach of maritime law. We are disrupting a vessel that's engaged in technically what is a fishing operation, and under maritime law that is illegal, but our job is to go down there and disrupt them, and certainly we were most effective at that, and I accept the Maritime New Zealand report. We do bear some responsibility for the collision. I think if we had have simply kept clear of all the whaling vessels in our entire time in Antarctica, there's no doubt no collision would have happened. But would that have taken Japan to the International Court of Justice? Would it have made the newspapers and radio and everyone go following the thing down there? Probably not. Sometimes your job as an activist is to create what I call a festering sore, and for that sometimes laws are broken.
You certainly did that. We'll get to that in one moment. One more question about this, though, at that point. It sounds to me from listening to you that you don't believe the captain of the Shonan Maru was trying to run you down.
I had the discussion with the first officer on the Shonan Maru No. 2. So I spent a month on that vessel going back to Japan. And at one stage I said to him, what were you guys thinking when you turned to starboard? And it took a few minutes to get it out of him. And he basically conceded that if a very minor damage had occurred to the bow of Earthrace, they knew it would be the end of our campaign. And all he had to do was a little bump. And I think it got exacerbated by those big vessels like the Shonan Maru No. 2. You can't put that on a dime at high speed. Like once you start turning, it's maybe 20 seconds before the vessel really starts to turn to starboard. And so once the captain of the Shonan Maru realised it was going to be much worse than he may have anticipated, it's too late. For you to correct that vessel is going to take another 10, 15 seconds, and it's too long. So looking back on it and having discussed it with the first officer, I think they probably thought a little wee glancing blow off the bow wouldn't have been a bad thing. And I believe it ended up much worse than what they had originally envisaged.
So you've got a boat with the nose off it missing, to put it bluntly and in non-practical and in non-professional terms. The boat's not about to sink. What do you do next as captain of the ship?
After the boat's been run over, I remember worrying that what had happened to Jason, I didn't really know how far back the damage was. And at this stage I'm thinking, our boat might actually sink. So I remember running inside the vessel, and Jason's he's sort of, looking at me, what he's supposed to do. I told him to put out a mayday call, so he put the mayday call out to the Bob Barker. I remember going forward then and seeing this big gaping wound in the bow and all of our stuff going around. I remember thinking, like we might get really low in the water. Either way, we have to get a life raft ready. So we had a life raft in the helm there, so we took it out the back and tied it off on the vessel, ready to go. Then I went inside, had made the radio call to the Bob Barker to launch their small boats, and then just started effectively a recovery operation. Whatever was going to happen, we knew that the vessel's time in terms of engaging the whalers was done on that campaign. So now it becomes a case of let's rescue all that might be vulnerable on the boat, and set up a program to affect the salvage of the vessel.
And how did the ship sink? How did the Ardie Girl sink?
So this is where it gets quite murky. So that afternoon, I got a call from Paul Watson, and he said, "What's the status of the Ardie Girl?" And I said, "Well, it's salvageable, but it is severely damaged." And he did sound me out about the possibility of scuttling the vessel. And then the following day, so at this stage we're still thinking there's a recovery operation underway. The following day, the call came through from Paul Watson. At this stage there's only four of us privy to this. There's myself, Paul Watson, Chuck Swift, and Luke Van Horn, who was the comms officer. So Paul gives us the order. He wants the vessel scuttled. Now keep in mind at this stage it's not my vessel. It's a Sea Shepherd vessel as far as I'm concerned. I've been ordered to scuttle it. But he didn't want the crew to know. And this is where, when I look at the last 10 years of my life, this is the period that I am embarrassed about. So I went into the boat that evening with Chuck Swift, who was a captain of the Bob Barker, and Luke Van Horn, and we scuttled the vessel. At this stage, the vessel was salvageable. It would have cost...
There's no doubt in your mind about that.
No doubt in my mind. I know I'd spoken with the designers by sat phone. They'd said, look, bring it in, and there was a recovery effort made to get the bow, and then that got left there. But the boat was definitely salvageable.
So it wasn't a practical decision to scuttle it. It was, to use your phrase earlier, to help create that festering wound.
Yeah, you'd have to ask Paul Watson what his intention was. I think if you look at what was put in the public domain, it was that we tried our best to salvage it. But that was definitely not the case. And that was transpired in a court case many years later that Adi Gill took against Sea Shepherd, where he won a substantial amount of money for the deliberate scuttling of his vessel. But I think the vessel was rammed and destroyed, maybe is more media worthy than the vessel is rammed and damaged. There was the case that our job really was to try and disrupt the whales. Our job was to disrupt the whaling. With the Bob Barker getting tied up on a salvage mission of Adi Gill, that's going to take up maybe a week or 3 or 4 days for us to get it to the French base, which was the initial plan. And so maybe Watson made the call, I want the Bob Barker to be going chasing the whalers rather than taking this boat down to Antarctica. And that still left the question of who was going to salvage the boat. But at this stage, it's technically, I looked on it as a Sea Shepherd boat, but it's actually owned by Adi Gill. And that's the dishonest bit that I struggle with. I went in under orders, I scuttled the vessel, and we were instructed to make it so that the sinking happens slowly. So the rest of the crew on the Bob Barker, they all think that they're doing their best to salvage this vessel. Meanwhile, it's slowly sinking in the water because we open the seacocks and the hatches and all those things. And it's pretty tough. This boat has been my life for, at this stage, 6 years. I mortgaged my house and put every cent that my wife and I owned into that vessel. And to then be asked to go and deliberately scuttle it, that was a very tough day.
And you're keeping the truth from your crew.
And keeping the truth from the crew. Not for long. It was the following day after the scuttling. I took my crew aside and I told them what had happened. And then the Sea Shepherd had a very strict policy in terms of who was allowed to say what to media. And it was made very plain to me, you better keep this till you go to your grave.
Made plain to you by Paul Watson.
Yeah, by Paul Watson, most definitely.
So have you and the crew transferred to Paul Watson's ship by this stage?
So we transferred to the Bob Barker,
Barker.
which is not Paul Watson's ship. It was Chuck Swift's.
And was it the Bob Barker that you then went from to board the Shonamaru No. 2?
Yeah, so when I first got on the Bob Barker, I made a proposal to Paul Watson that the goal was to give you some background on this. The ramming of the Adi Gill never made it on television in Japan. It was a page 4, page 5 story in a few newspapers. It made a tiny little ripple in media, and yet in Western media it was the number 1 story in almost all Western outlets. Whaling in Japan was a real non-issue. I'll give you an example. It's a little bit like abortion in New Zealand. People know it happens, but it's not something you're going to discuss at the dinner table. It's not something that's really put out in the public domain. It happens, people are aware of it, but it's not an issue that is under any debate. Whaling is the same in Japan. No one discusses it. And
so you needed a follow-up event in order to maximise the publicity.
I wanted to take the fight to Japan somehow. And my crew, in joining the Adi Gill, they had all agreed if we got a chance to get you aboard one of the whaling vessels, they had all agreed to be able to do that. Now my vessel is gone. In some ways, it's freed me up to go doing that mission. So I proposed it to Chuck Swift. He proposed it to Paul Watson. Paul Watson agreed. And then, so we started running missions to try and get me aboard one of their vessels. And at this stage, we're being followed by the Shonan Murray No. 2. I've got a greater reason to board it. They've run over my boat. I'm going to go on there and cheekily give them a bill for $3 million for the repair of it. But the goal is to go back to Japan as a prisoner. And my belief was that in doing that, Japanese media would finally give whaling in Japan some traction.
Okay. So you boarded the Shonamaru No. 2. How did you make your way to the bridge? Presumably you went and found the captain? Just describe getting on board the ship for me.
So we made probably 4 or 5 attempts on the Bob Barker, but they all failed. They then transferred me and the rest of my crew to the Steve Irwin, and we went back to Perth, and the Steve Irwin refueled. Paul Watson kept me on board with a specific goal of boarding the Shonan Murray No. 2, and it kind of became one of the key missions. And Animal Planet, who were filming it, they were all over the story. At one stage, they looked to drop me onto the boat by parachute, which I sort of agreed to, but I mean, this is pretty high risk. So anyhow,
in Antarctic waters,
in Antarctic, what could possibly go wrong? But we spent many hours, many days trying to figure out how to do it, and after multiple attempts, I concluded the only way to do it was at night. During the day, the crew of the Shona Murray have these impulse guns that they shoot pepper spray at you. And the impulse guns are normally used for crowd control, and you can hit an area the size of a tennis court and spray it completely. So they're a very intimidating weapon. They've got anti-boarding nets up the side. They've got crew running around with big poles to go whacking you with. And then along the side of these vessels are these anti-boarding spikes, great big steel spikes at the side. So it's a very difficult vessel to board. And in the day, all their crew need to do is come and shoot you with pepper spray, and it's all over. So I concluded it had to be done at night, but that presents risk. You're in these very dangerous waters, and how do you get under the anti-boarding spikes? If you go on a Zodiac, as soon as the boat rolls down, you're going to get your pontoons all harpooned, and then you're dead in the water. There was one anti-boarding spike missing, and they're about 2 metres down the length of the boat. So that meant there was a 4 metre gap. And I remember looking at it and thinking our jet ski was 3.6 metres. We could just slide between where there was this tiny gap. And so myself and my engineer, Larry, we spent a long time trying to figure out, this is the point, trying to memorise where it is and figure out, is it possible to do this? If the waves are coming from this way, how's it going to work out? So we spent a long time putting this mission together, and in the end made the proposal to Paul Watson, and also then the crew of Steve Irwin was brought in, the crew of the Bob Barker was brought in. And the Japanese are very wary, like you probably get one crack at this. The jet ski has an advantage. It has a relatively small radar signature. So it will be a small blip on a radar, but when you've got big swelling waves in Antarctica, it's hidden amongst all the clutter and noise on your radar system. So I remember thinking, we do have a chance of this. So I can't remember the time, might have been like 2 a.m. or whatever. Larry and I, we launched this jet ski, and the Steve Irwin slows down temporarily. We don't want it to look like the vessel stops, so it slows down temporarily, accelerates back up as soon as we're in the water. So on this, we've got 3 of us, myself, Larry driving, I'm in the middle, and then they talked me into taking this Animal Planet cameraman. And he's done like 5 or 6 seasons of Deadliest Catch, hardcore cameraman. He kept his camera rolling for about 30 seconds and then put it away. And that was the last footage he got. And he said at one stage when he got back, he said, oh, it's the scariest I've ever been in my life. I just simply wanted to survive the night. Animal Planet doesn't pay me enough for this. So anyway, the 3 of us on the jet ski. And jet skis with 3 people are quite tricky. And back then, jet skis were smaller. And we kept kind of half tipping over. Once we got under speed, it was much better, and I got this cameraman basically to be kneeling on the stern of this jet ski, keeping as low as he can. I'm keeping nice and low, and Larry's just trying to navigate these waves. And there was a couple of metres of swell and probably about a half-metre chop. So it's not perfect conditions, but it's about as good as you ever get in Antarctica. And we knew a weather front was coming. We had that night to do it, or from about 6 o'clock the next morning. It would be much more difficult. And so we circled round behind the Steve Irwin, behind the Shona Murray number 2, and then pulled up alongside on the port side of it. And I was trying to use my night vision, but we kept getting spray from the jet ski and the vessel up on it. So that sort of ended up being no good. So I just had to basically use the little bit of light there was. But it was very difficult. I remember Larry, as he came in, we couldn't see these anti-boarding spikes. Like we knew they were there, but it was just this big black mass. And Larry was trying to memorise where they were from the superstructure that he could see. But anyway, he pulls in, and then I think one of the boarding spikes hits Larry, and then he backed away, and then he came back in, and then a couple of times we smacked into the Shona Murray number 2. And this jet ski's pretty fragile. But anyway, his job is to get me close enough and say when he's happy for me to go. So he says go, and I remember clambering up on the side of this thing, and I managed to get so my feet were on the lower deck level, and I'm clinging onto the side trying to get hold of something, and the vessel rolled down a swell, and this wave comes up and swept me off. So now I'm in the water, and the jet ski carries on, and so and suddenly everything goes quiet as I just hear as the Shona Murray disappears off in the distance, and So I'm sitting there waiting, and I've got a flare on me, so I can set a flare off. All the crew on the Stevo know if a flare goes off, the mission's over. But I don't want to do that because then the mission's aborted. So I'm sitting there waiting and waiting and waiting. And Larry, what he's done, I only found this out later. He saw me board, but he never heard me call him on the radio to say that I'd successfully boarded. So he didn't see me fall in. So he's waiting for the call. Nothing happens. So he says, one of two things has happened. Pete's radio's damaged, or he can't make the call, is one. Or the second thing is he fell in. If he's fallen in, I better go and pick him up. And if he's on the boat, then my mission's successful in any case. So all he does is he's following back along. He can see with a little bit of light, he's following the trail. And he said, next thing there, I was like 6 feet in front of him. I remember him, he just came over the top of this wave, and then there was this jet ski. I said, whoa. Clambered back on, made a second attempt. And on the second attempt, virtually the same thing happened. I got on the side, clinging onto this boarding net. As the boat rolled into the swell, I fall out, clinging onto this net. But it didn't roll so far, and the wave only came up maybe to about my knee level. And then as the vessel came back upright, I pulled the knife out of I had a knife sort of tied onto my calf. I pulled the knife out, cut the boarding net, and jumped on the vessel. And I remember sitting down. I was worried the crew had heard me, but I remember thinking, I crouched down, and sort of very dark here. I remember thinking, like, we have made a little bit of history here. I knew we'd created history. And I don't know how it's going to play out from here, but it was one of the most satisfying feelings I've ever had in my life. We spent a month trying to make this happen, and not an easy thing to achieve. And as a team, we'd managed to pull it off. And in many ways, I was the lucky guy in the forefront of this quite daring mission in hindsight.
Lucky's a word, possibly not the one I'd use, but anyway, you get taken to Japan. You're arrested on 5 charges, I believe. You get put inside a maximum security prison. What's a day in a Japanese maximum security prison like?
Oh, maximum security prison's pretty difficult, really. The good thing is you're in your cell 23 and a half hours a day. You have half an hour per day in an exercise yard, and then Monday and Thursday you have a shower bath, and that's sort of like a group setting. There's 4 baths. You go in there, you get under the shower, which is like 3 feet off the ground. You sort of squat down and get clean until the guards are satisfied you're clean enough. They give you a nod. You jump in the bath, and you get, I think it was like 9 minutes in total to do that. And so the food is horrible. It's like every meal, I call it miso, but it's basically cabbage soup, boiled veggies, maybe a very small piece of fish or a little bit of meat. Thursday night was curry night. I remember the first time I had this curry, it was just chicken gristle. Like, restaurants cut out all the gristle bits, and so I'm looking for this chicken and putting the gristle aside. At the end of it, there's no chicken, it's just gristle. I lost a lot of weight in Japanese prison, a lot of weight. I think I come out, I was like 61 kilos, like I'm 75 normally. Lost a lot of weight, very angry place, a lot of angry men, a lot of broken men.
Were you in physical danger?
There was a couple times that I think guys were lining me up. Prison's a funny place. You kind of become an actor. The trouble in prison, no one messes at the top. You've got your very violent offenders, your Yakuza, no one messes with them. Down the bottom is your sort of maybe drug addicts, kids, old men, no one bothers there. Trouble's always in the middle area in a prison. And I saw plenty of horrible stuff, and was sort of wondering whether my time would come up and I'd end up getting smacked up. I saw the guards on the floor won't touch you. Every time there's trouble, there was this group of 25, I called them the stormtroopers, but it was a group of 25 guards, and they would run in unison, all dressed in black and armed with tasers and pepper spray and all sorts of stuff. So if there's any trouble, the floor goes in lockdown. It takes 2 minutes for the stormtroopers to arrive on the floor, and they would deal with whatever mess it was. And so it didn't take them long to sort it out. But if you got taken by those guys, like, it's a bad situation you're in, and I'm just trying to keep my nose clean here. There was a couple of funny things that helped me. One was the Japanese, by this stage, are all over the story. And I remember my first night in prison, I'm the lead story. And I sort of heard this, and I'm pretending I'm a tough guy. And in no way I'm not violent, I'm not tough, I make no claims on anything like that. And I'm pretending that if anyone messes with me, I'm going to rip their head off. And so anyway, the lead item on the news is was my arrest and my placement in prison. So I put my arms up and I was saying, that's me. So I'm pretending I'm this tough guy. And at max security prison there, you're not allowed to speak. So prison there is deathly quiet until if there's a fight or there's any violence or anything like that, then people are all yelling until the fight is over. As soon as the fight's over, back to being deathly quiet. And so I got in trouble with the guards because I'd started speaking or yelling more to the point. And a few times, I saw guys got taken away because they couldn't stop yelling at night. There was a couple of drug addicts in the prison there, and you get 2 warnings. Third warning, the stormtroopers come in and take you away and deal to you. So I found prison a very difficult place, and I think for the first 3 or 4 months, probably okay, but the last month I definitely struggled, and I came out a different person, and not all for the better.
By the time your trial is underway, the Sea Shepherd organisation have distanced themselves from you. They claim that was tactics later. Is that correct?
No. When they distanced themselves from me, it was detrimental to my case, and that they said I'd taken a banned weapon to Antarctica. It wasn't a banned weapon. Paul Watson had given me permission to take it.
This was the bow and arrow.
This is the bow and arrow. And what happened while I was in prison, Whale Wars is an Animal Planet TV show, is airing in the US, and there's this episode where it's got me and my crew practicing the bow and arrow on the back deck of Adi Gill. Paul Watson puts out a press statement saying that Pete Bethune he took a banned weapon to Antarctica. He's been expelled from Sea Shepherd, and that quite literally broke my heart. I never found out until one of my lawyers turns up. And he said, "Oh, by the way, Sea Shepherd's expelled you, just so you know." And it hurt my case, my lawyers spent a long time trying to figure out what our response would be to this. What do we say? And in the end, they said the best we can do is sort of say that it guarantees that Pete Bethune won't be going to Antarctica again. But my lawyers certainly were most uncomfortable about what had happened over my expulsion from Sea Shepherd. But I think at the same time what happened was there was a big backlash, and especially in America over it. Here's this guy in prison on your behalf. He's taken a bow and arrow. Who cares? The whalers have got explosive harpoons. They've got 12-gauge shotguns. All of the Sea Shepherd vessels carry shotguns. That Steve Irwin had a 50 cal for a while. Pete Bethune's got a bow and arrow. Who cares? And so there was this big backlash against them, and I think what they decided was to sort of stop the bloodletting. They came back and said, we just did it to assist Pete Bethune's court case, but it didn't help me.
So when you called them liars, you meant it. It wasn't a tactic.
Yeah, it wasn't a tactic. I think in hindsight they just did their best they could under the circumstances, and Paul Watson made the call that booting me out was the best tactic. But then with all the venom that was being put on Facebook about it, after I got out, he sort of apologised and said, it was always a tactic. I knew that wasn't the case, but I was willing to forgive and forget and move on. I mean, I still loved the organisation, and I'm still pretty determined to contribute against Japanese whaling. And so I sort of said to Paul, look, it doesn't matter, let's move on. But in the end, it was probably the start of the end of my involvement with Sea Shepherd. I distanced myself from them about 4 or 5 months later, and when I came clean about what had happened to the Adi Gill.
You were potentially facing 15 years in a Japanese prison. You got 2 years. And I'm slightly unclear about Japanese law here. Depending on which news report I'd read, you either admitted or pleaded guilty to 4 of the 5 charges. What was the actual case?
So under the Japanese judicial system is very difficult. If they charge you with something, you will be found guilty. There's no two ways about it. The conviction rate is almost 99%. The prosecutors charged me with 5 things, which included assault. And the assault was a fabrication. There's no way I assaulted anyone. And this goes back to one of the tactics that Sea Shepherd had, was to shoot rotten butter onto the deck of the Nishin Maru or onto the decks of other vessels. So on this day, I was ordered to go and shoot this rotten butter onto the Shonan Maru number 2. As we pull up to it, the guys are there with the pepper spray, and I fire one of these rotten butter things out of a potato gun. I fire it, and it hits up by the helm. At around the same time, the two security guys on the back of this boat, they shoot these impulse guns at us, but they shoot them forward and into the breeze. And as the boat's moving forward, this cloud of pepper spray comes back over them. And so those two guys all got hit with their own pepper spray. They put a press release out saying that it was me shooting the rotten butter that had caused the injury. So then when I get back to Japan, the 4 charges they lay against me, I don't care. Like possession of a knife, I needed a knife to cut the net. Boarding a boat without permission, I don't mind. Disruption of business in Antarctic waters,
that was
my
point to
job.
be there.
You know, I got no problem with that. Destruction of property, yeah, I did cut a net to board the vessel. So those 4 charges I'm fine with. But the assault charge was a fabrication, and it's very hard when you're in court. And there was 4 Japanese were interviewed, the 3 guys who sustained injuries from shooting themselves, and then there was also the captain of the Shonan Maru. They're all standing there, and I remember one of the questions placed to each 4 of them was, what do you think should happen to Captain Bethune? All 4 of them said he should be punished to the maximum level of the law, was the translation that I got. And it's pretty hard to sit there and watch that. And so anyway, once the Japanese have charged me with those 4 things plus the assault charge, my lawyers are saying, look, you will be found guilty. And I'm determined, I want to plead not guilty. So we came up with sort of a compromise. And part of it was that we would sort of say why the whaling was wrong, and we would argue my case, but I would also apologise. And I think this is where my lawyers probably did a good job. I only have influence here over what the sentence is. I'm going to be found guilty, but am I sentenced to 6 months, 2 years, 5 years, 15 years, whatever? I have a degree of control over that by how much I apologise and how much contrition I show. So my lawyers are sort of saying, like don't get too stressed over the pleading not guilty bit. We'll argue your case and say that you don't believe it was you, but you're also going to apologise. And I didn't like the apologising, but leading up to this, my lawyers are saying, you're going to get 2 to 5 years. You better prepare your family for this. And so this is where it's starting to get dark for me. I thought I'd do a couple of weeks, and I've now done 3 months. My lawyers are telling me I'm going to be doing 2 to 5 years. They ran my boat over. All I did was board their boat without permission. So I'm thinking things are getting a little bit unfair here.
So you've miscalculated a little bit.
Yeah, miscalculated. But, at this stage I'm still thinking, like if I get out of here soon, I'll be okay. But if I end up doing 2 to 5 years, that is a really unfair system. So anyway, I said to my lawyers, I said, how can we make this better? And they said, there's nothing you can do. I said, what about if I speak in court? And I don't have to speak in court. As soon as I start speaking, I open myself up to being interrogated by the other lawyers, and you can easily dig a hole, and especially when you're in a country with another language. So I said to my lawyers, what's the best thing I can do? And they said, you just need to trust us. And I said, I want to speak in court. And my lawyers initially resisted it for about a week. And eventually I said, what about if I give you what I want to say, you put it in Japanese, and I will learn it phonetically. So they finally agreed to this. So I wrote out what I wanted to say and was very aggressive. And my lawyers are sort of saying, you need to show contrition. None of this shows contrition here. So what they did was they very cleverly rewrote it in a very Japanese kind of way, that it sort of said, this is why whaling is important to New Zealand and Australia. This is why they think it's wrong. I never meant to hurt anyone, and I apologise profusely in those things. And so I think it was about 12 minutes that I memorised in its entirety. It's very hard when you're in prison that you're not allowed to speak to, but I spent, it took me about a month to get it. And when it finally turned up in court, I remember getting up there and speaking it, and on the whole, I did a really good job. Like I'm a good orator. If I need to make a speech or something, I can learn it and I can deliver. And I knew the words that I had to accentuate. I knew the words that I could speak very, very softly. And my lawyers afterwards, they said that was a turning point in the case. They said the fact everyone believed that I was fluent Japanese at this stage. All I've done is learn 12 minutes of Japanese.
And do you and your lawyers think that was why you got a suspended sentence?
Yeah.
There was no deal done?
No,
there wasn't a deal made by the New Zealand government or Sea Shepherd or you to not go to the Southern Ocean anymore, and you would get a suspended sentence?
There was never any deal. And the embassy staff, they made that very clear to me. They said, look, this is a foreign judicial system. We have no influence. Our job is to turn up to the court case and ensure you get a fair trial, but we have no influence. So there was never any deal done. Various people have said that there was a deal done of me not going back to Antarctica. That wasn't the case.
Is it possible that there were things going on in the background that you didn't know about? Because our government was playing a very straight bat on it.
It may have been possible that the New Zealand government had spoken to the Japanese government, but I don't believe so. I wouldn't rule it out entirely. Japan is a very independent judicial system, and I don't think there was any interference, but I could be wrong. And John Key might come out in a few years and say, "Oh, by the way, Pete, I did have a word, and they did have a word to the judges." But if
Which
you
would be a
look
bit
at
of
it,
a climb down for you, wouldn't it?
you
You called them lapdogs of the Japanese.
Yeah, I was pretty scathing of the New Zealand government. Actually, that got me in a bit of trouble. That coming, I said New Zealand had become like a fat little lapdog to the Japanese, and certainly John Key took exception to that.
There's an odd thing here, though. There was a news report that your wife Sharon said before the sentence was handed down, and that it was a suspended sentence, that you were so confident of getting a suspended sentence that you were planning a party back in Auckland that weekend. How could you be so confident?
I don't think I was, but I am an optimist. And I remember that, keep in mind that from when I give my speech to when sentencing is handed down, that's a month period. And so there was a lot of time for media to digest what had happened. And through that time, my lawyer started to say, like, we think you might actually get a suspended sentence. And keep in mind, and I think probably the key to that was certainly my speech was very apologetic and had a great degree of contrition. And my lawyer started to say, you might be lucky. And I was all of the way through my case. I never thought I'd do 5 months at any stage. I was thinking, I'm going to be out in a week, and then that week's up. I could be out in 3 weeks. I'll be out in 5. I was always trying to look on the bright side. And so I remember thinking, leading up to when the sentence was handed down, I remember sort of thinking, like, I am going to be going back. I didn't know, but I, tried convincing myself that there was a good chance. My lawyers at the stage had said, you may end up with 2 to 5 years, or it may be suspended. They thought it unlikely I'd get less than 2. They thought I'd either get suspended or I'd get somewhere between 2 and 5 years. But they did say that the speech I gave, where I showed a lot of contrition, that helped our case enormously.
Nearly 8 years later, Japan is back in the southern waters and whaling again. Did you lose the war?
Here's one of the things that happened. I was at about the 4-month stage. A journalist from the Japan Times turned up and said, and after
you're still in prison at this point. 4 months into
I'm
prison.
still in prison. This Japanese journalist turned up, and she held a press release up against the glass partition, and it announced that Australia was taking Japan to the International Court of Justice over their illegal whaling. And she said, have you got a comment on this? I remember I just broke down in tears at the time, and I was in a fragile state by then, but also I realised the significance of it. So in many ways, 2010 was the tipping point in terms of public opinion about Japanese whaling. It was the year that New Zealand really woke up to Japanese whaling. Australia, there was massive protest while I was in prison, and it forced the Australian government to announcing court action. Now, New Zealand at the stage hadn't gone along with it, and that was why I called the New Zealand government these fat little lapdogs to the Japanese, because we'd basically abandoned Australia's court action, but I believed it was the right thing to do. And then I think about a year later, the key government announced they were joining Australia in the court action. I went to the court case, and also when the verdict was handed down. Japan lost the case. It took 4 years for that to happen. Japan lost the case, and the International Court of Justice said that their whaling was illegal, and it was in breach of the IWC, and it was in breach of international law. Japan then withdrew from Antarctica for a year. They then brought in a new so-called scientific whaling program, which has a quota of 333 whales as opposed to 1,000. One of the things I learned as a conservationist, you celebrate your victories because they are few and far between. And to see the Japanese quota go from 1,000 down to 333, that is a victory.
Yes, but they doubled the space of the ocean in which they were able to take those whales from. Like I say, you may have won a battle, which was the ICJ court decision. Did you lose the war?
The war is still going, and I would argue the case. The fact that they've doubled the area they've still chopped their quota down by 2/3. I see that as a victory, but it's not the total victory I would like. And conservation's a tough game. You have to play a long game in it. And I think there will come a time where Japan will withdraw from whaling in Antarctica. It might be another 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. You've got to remember too, 2010, there was a significant drop in whale consumption in Japan, and I was the lucky guy in the middle of making that happen. Not only me, it was the first time the Japanese realised this is pissing off Kiwis and Aussies. No one in Japan had any idea that was the case. It was the first time media in Japan ever discussed whaling as an issue, and it put it in the public domain. And then you started seeing some intellectuals coming out and questioning it and saying, should we continue doing this? There was debate in Parliament over it. So it made it an issue in Japan, and it wasn't a total victory, but whale consumption has dropped. It's one of the reasons I think the Japanese, they don't need to take 1,000 whales anymore because they can't sell them. And, I was part of sort of making that happen, as was a number of other NGOs and individuals who also work towards it. But Japan, it's a very tough country to influence. We have the same issue now over things like we've been working trying to stop pangolin smuggling and rhino horn trafficking, these various things. For a little white boy from New Zealand to influence 1.5 billion Chinese is very tough. You've got to play a long game on these things, and the same applies to Japanese whaling.
Maybe 5 years, maybe 10 years, maybe 20 years might come to a halt. What could New Zealand be doing, or rather what should New Zealand be doing now to help bring that about?
I would love to see the New Zealand government send a patrol boat and follow those whalers right round Antarctica. You did see that many years ago. There was an Australian Coast Guard vessel that followed them round, and with Sea Shepherd having withdrawn from activities in Antarctica, send a New Zealand patrol boat down there, go and do some monitoring of the tooth fishery. It's the Wild West down there. There's no one going down there now. I remember when we were there were so many illegal long lines set for toothfish, and it's New Zealand's backyard. In some ways we claim it. We're issuing quota for the harvesting of toothfish in Antarctica. We have an obligation to send patrol boats down there. I think we should send one down there and use it to go monitoring the Japanese whaling and put that footage and those photos around the world.
What's a part of the story you've never been able to tell before that you'd really like to say?
I think the bit I spoke about, what really happened over the sinking. There's very little of that in the public domain. I think and I'm embarrassed for my role and all that. The rest of it's been told a few times, but those were dark days. I remember when I came back. So when I got back to New Zealand after Japan, and immigration, they took me into a room where all my family and friends were before I'd sort of merged into the media scrum, and I was a mess. And first thing I did was I blurted out what had happened over the sinking of the Eddie Gill. I was part of what was a pretty dishonest act, really. And it was quite a few months later that I apologised to Eddie Gill and came clean about it. But I'm pretty embarrassed about my role and all that. I can argue at the time, under a lot of stress, I took the order and followed orders. But at the end of it, I was a captain of the vessel and I still went along with it. And I think it was probably the wrong thing to do. If I was in a similar situation again, I'd handle it quite differently, I would hope. And I paid a heavy price for what I did. Remember I got back, I had no money. And I called up a friend of mine in Atlanta who, if I ever get in real trouble, he'll loan me some money or help me out. And I called him up and he sent 10 grand over to me to just tide me and Sharon over. And I went down to the bank on the Monday and the 10 grand wasn't in the account. And I remember looking at this little wee bank teller, and I was looking how far away she was from me, whether I could grab her throat. Now that's
where you'd gotten to.
That's not in my nature. Prison in Japan, it changed me, and not all for the better. And I struggled concentrating. I was trying to write a book, I just couldn't concentrate on anything. I was quite a mess. In hindsight, probably had a degree of PTSD or other things going on. And they were very difficult times for me. But as I look at it, I'm really proud of the role I played. It wasn't just me. There was a Sea Shepherd team, there was Greenpeace, and tens of thousands of people played a role protesting and many other things. And I was, in many ways, the lucky guy in all the middle of that. But I did pay a price for it. And when I look at things today, I'm comfortable with everything I did, except for the scuttling. That was the wrong thing to do. But the rest of it, I did the best I could. And it's not a total victory, but, we all tried our best.
Pete Bethune, thank you very much.
Thanks. Pleasure.